My name is Stacy Sabraw, and I'm an instructor here at Michigan State University. And the reason I'm presenting Dictogloss to you today is for a couple of reasons. One, I think it really appropriately fits the theme for this conference, which is integrated grammar. And the other reason is that I just graduated in 2012, and I did a research project with a couple of classmates and a professor, and we used Dictogloss as our task in our experiment. So I feel like I have some depth to offer you in this particular task, as well as some assessment things, which I think will hopefully be at least good food for thought for you. Okay, so I do want to point out that you have a packet with you, and I just want to briefly tell you what these three things are. So the first one is a description of the assessment part. So this is something that we will refer to later, but not in the beginning. Your second packet is actually materials that you can take home and use. So there's instructions for the task, as well as the worksheets that you can take home, and you could use them on Monday if you want to, okay? And finally, there is a chart, and this is also a component of the assessment, and I kept this loose because hopefully you will be able to use this with the assessment packet. So these two things will go together, and that way you can look at them side by side. Okay? So that's what I have given you. So when I'm talking about the task in general, you might want to refer to this, but I don't actually have the task outline on the handout specifically. Okay? So let's get into this. So we're going to talk about what Dictogloss is, what the value of this task is. We'll talk about materials preparation. So this is a very practical-oriented session. We'll talk about what do you do in a Dictogloss, and then we'll talk about the grammar assessment component. How many of you guys know what SLO means? Okay, that is, what does that stand for?
Specific learning outcomes.
Okay, specific learning outcomes or student learning outcomes. So I have some TLOs today. Okay, so this is my hope that at the end of this session that you will have a working definition of Dictogloss, that you will know the value of this task and how it might fit into your particular context, that you will know the criteria and resources for text selection, that you will understand how to facilitate a Dictogloss task, and that you will understand and have practice in assessing grammar in Dictogloss productions. So let's get down to the meaning of Dictogloss first. So I want to see first who has used Dictogloss before. Okay, so, or half hand, yeah, I see that. Okay, good, because I don't want to repeat myself if most of us have used this task, but if we haven't, then I know where to go from here. Okay, so for those of you who have used this task, what's the difference between a dictation and a Dictogloss? What would you say the difference is?
Dictation is verbatim, and Dictogloss is.
Okay, that's a nice way to say it. Dictation is verbatim and Dictogloss is not. What's the gloss part of this term? Nadine, you raise your hand. Do you know what the gloss part is of this term?
Nope.
Okay. So gloss, of course, is sometimes, in this case, what it means is, think about when you're trying to translate a word in English into a word in Chinese. And in this case, there's not a one-to-one. So you do what's called a gloss. So it's kind of the closest in meaning. And so that's a nice way to think of what this task is that you're hearing a specific text, but then in reproducing that text, you are not expected to reproduce it word for word in the same order. You are expected to keep the meaning and hopefully the grammar, but otherwise then there's room for creativity, which is one of the things that I like about this task. Okay, so that's what the meaning of Dictogloss itself is, and then the task entails kind of 4 phases. So you have read the text to your students and they listen, and we'll go over these in more detail in a moment. Then they try they take notes and listen to the text a second time. Then they try to recreate it. Then they are paired and do a paired reconstruction. And then you take those productions and match them back to the original text and help them see that, you know, things that were successful and things that were not successful. So let me just kind of review a little bit. So this is a collaborative written text reconstruction task, and that's of course the paired part of this task. It's similar to dictation, but it's not but a word-for-word transcription is impossible most of the time. So it's really amazing. After listening twice, students attempt to recreate the text from memory. They should be, the content should be the same, but wording can change. And then grammatical accuracy is stressed, and that's why I'm presenting this task today. And then after writing a draft individually, pairs write one final draft together. So this is kind of an overview of what this task is about. So then I want to briefly go into why I think this is a valuable task, and then we'll talk about what are we doing with this task. Okay, so one value is that this is an integrated task. So as Hinkle says, Dictogloss incorporates the integration of all 4 skills. We have listening, we have speaking, we have reading, and we have writing. And as a teacher, I also like that this is a more authentic type of task. This would be something that students would be doing in their regular academic classes. Another value is that this is collaborative, and we know from research that Dictogloss provides meaningful interaction and negotiation of meaning. And of course, this especially happens at the paired work stage. And more support for this comes from Storch, and she says that Dictogloss calls for metalinguistic discussion. So again, negotiation of meaning, but you know, this should be past perfect, this should be passive, you know, these kinds of specific grammatical discussions. And this allows for more what they call language-related episodes, LREs. And this is where the attention to form comes into play and helps students negotiate, well, kind of actually test their hypotheses, their language hypotheses. One other thing I like about Dictogloss is that it provides immediate feedback. And there is much research that supports this idea. This is just one of many. But the idea is that students learn best when they generate a hypothesis and then receive immediate feedback to test that hypothesis. So I like that immediacy rather than a delayed time in feedback. So the 3 things that I find valuable for this task is that it's integrated, it's collaborative, and it provides immediate feedback. So now let's talk about materials. Let's talk about what does a Dictogloss text look like. First thing is that it shouldn't be too big because they're going to get it orally first. So a text of between 120 and 125 words is usually a pretty good measure. You would raise or lower this based on the proficiency of your class. Ideally, you would make the subject similar to course material. I think a lot of us are supporters of content-based instruction, so if we can reinforce that content by including that in our text, that's a good practice. Try to find and or create a text that is reading level appropriate for your students. You know, think about it from that aspect, so not just the topic, not just the length, but the level of the overall level of the language. Same overall discourse structure, which is a fancy way to say keep it all descriptive, keep it all narrative, keep it all expository, keep it a consistent type of language. Also, because this is a grammar task, you want to include several instances of the grammar point. You know, 5 or more is pretty good. The task that I have shared with you actually has 8 in it. It's slightly longer, but this was, our particular context was for intermediate students. And something else to think about is to include no more than 3 to 4 low frequency vocabulary words. And if you're not familiar, you can go to, there's no marker, you can go to Lex Tutor. And okay, so we've got, I've seen some head nods. You can plug your text in there and you will immediately know what the word frequency is. And if you, oh.
Can I raise markers?
And since I saw some head nods, please, I think it's Lex Tutor. Just Lex Tutor. Okay. one or both of these will get you there, and this is very useful for more than just this task. But if you're trying to say, well, how do I know if it's low frequency words? This is a quick and easy way to find out. Okay, so let's briefly talk about text and task resources. I actually, in the first handout on page 5, if you want a pre-prepared task, there are several resources here listed for you. If you already do this task and you'd like to think about some variations on this task, then I also recommend this study by Jacobson Small. Really nice list of different ways that you can carry out this task. So those are 2 resources for you. And then of course the material set that I have provided for you as well. When we were creating texts for our research project, we found out what the topics were that the students were studying, and then we either pulled something from the textbook that perhaps they've not studied yet, and just, what we would do is make sure, okay, do we have enough of the grammar points in here? Is the vocabulary okay? And then we just went for it. So ideally, the text creation is not too much of a task, but you do want to slow down and think it through before you give it to your students, and I'll talk about a couple of things that we learned along the way that hopefully will be helpful to you as well. Okay, so now we know what Dictogloss is, we know how to get a text together for it, so now let's talk about the task. There are 9 steps, which sounds like a lot, but some of them are very quick. The first thing you want to do is to do priming. Okay, so you want to prime them for the topic, for the vocabulary, and for the grammar. So you want to choose a previously studied topic. That's ideal. It's not, you don't have to. And you also want to prime the students by eliciting basic concepts. And I'll show you an example in a moment. Also think about priming them for lexical items. You might want to list 3 to 4 vocabulary words or verbs that they might have difficulty with. And then of course the grammar. So this to me is more of a culminating type task, so you want to choose a structure that students have previously studied, and you want to directly say what the grammatical feature is that students should pay attention to when they're listening and writing. This is actually part of the task. So here's an example of how I would prime students for the topic that is in this materials packet, and if you look on the second page, this is 7 billion and rising, so it has to do with more or less overpopulation, or at least population in countries. Okay, and so with my students, I would ask them how many people live in the world right now, what countries have problems because of overpopulation, do all countries have a problem with overpopulation? And I mean, you could adjust this up or down, again, based on who your students are and what level they're at. And then I would also take time to review the meaning of these 4 particular vocabulary words, because I know these are going to be a challenge for my students. So United Nations, population, double as a verb, that's novel, and threaten to as a verb. And this is by examining the text and saying, I think these might be some places of challenge, and if I can support them a little bit before they're writing it, I think that they'll be more successful. Okay, so then the second step is you do the first reading. You tell the students that this time they will only listen, they will not take notes. And then you read the text aloud at a normal speed. I'm going to list this later, but some of the things that you can do to help with listening comprehension is to either read slightly slower than normal, especially if you have a lower level class. And something that we found kind of worked pretty well was to put slightly longer pauses between the sentences. So those are 2 things to think about in adjusting your readings for your students. Okay, so then you're going to pass out the individual sheet. This one is pretty fancy. My colleague Ryan Lidster created this for our research project, and he clearly is a graphics man, but it does not have to be this fancy. It can just be, the instructions and the vocabulary and the note-taking space and then the writing space. And this is exactly the one that I've given you. Okay, and then you instruct your students to listen and take notes this second time as you read the text for a second time. And then you instruct them to recreate the text, and you give them about 10 minutes for this task. And as it says here, instruct students to reconstruct text as closely as possible and paying attention to meaning and making sentences grammatically correct. I try to keep it to just those two things. Keep the meaning, keep the grammar as much as you can, and I usually do remind the students, remember the grammar focus is blah blah. In this particular task, the grammar focus was gerunds and infinitives. Okay. Whoops. And so this is an example of a solo production, and this is actually the full production. So that kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like. And then you want to pair your students and pass out the paired sheet. And I want to briefly talk about pairing your students, okay? So usually we think about students can work with someone that they're choosing or someone they're familiar with. You can think about high-low to kind of have the high help the low. You can also think about high-high, which would of course also mean low-low. So matching kind of more equal ability. But honestly, what we found worked the best as far as pairing is what we call the bracket form. So kind of taking the class in order of, more or less grade or proficiency, cut it in half, and then the high of the top group gets matched with the high of the lower group. And then we found that generally that was a pretty good matchup for being able to work with each other and everybody benefiting the most. At this stage, you want to instruct students to combine their individual texts, making sentences grammatically correct. Students are not allowed to change their individual versions at this stage. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that we actually gave different pens for this phase. But that's kind of, maybe extra diligence than you need to have in your classroom, depending on what you want to do with the productions. But it's just, I thought it kind of made our life easier, and so I wanted to pass that on to you. Okay, and so here's an example paired production from this class, just to have an idea of what it looks like. Sorry, it's pretty pixelated. The next step is to collect both the individual and paired versions, and then finally to review 1 or 2 or 3, depending on how much time you have in the class, with the original text, and paying attention both to the matching of meaning and the matching of grammar. So here's the full task: priming, first reading, handing out the individual sheet, reading it a second time, letting the students take notes at this stage, then allowing them 10 minutes to reconstruct their text, then pairing them with someone and giving the paired sheet, then allowing 15 minutes, and sometimes they finish earlier than this, but allowing about 15 minutes for the paired reconstruction, then collecting all of the productions and reviewing some of them against the original text with your student. Okay, any questions or comments at this point? Yes?
Do you do the individual, so you said you don't want them to go back and change their individual, is it because you want to see what they were capable of individually?
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, so now I want to move on to, actually I referred to the fact that I was going to talk about this. So for the text itself, if you want to adjust it for your students, you can think about using shorter, more cognitively simple texts, shorter sentences, certainly probably less complex than the example I've given you today. And also, again, as I said, when you're reading, to speak at a slower speech rate and or put longer pauses between sentences. I'm really an advocate of the second one especially. I think that allows your students' brain to catch up. Okay, now let's go on to the assessment part. So we can assess student written productions in many, many ways, looking at content, accuracy, complexity, fluency, but the type of measurement that I want to focus on today, because this is grammar focused, is the target grammar form. So I think now is a good time to have this out. This is your chart. And I want to, before we go to this, I want to just talk about a couple of assessment challenges. So Dictogloss, used in a form-focused grammar, can be used in a form-focused grammar class. And when you write the text, of course, there's a specific target. But these were the challenges that we found in trying to assess these productions, is that students used a different but grammatical form, or they used a different ungrammatical form, or they used the form in other contexts, and this might be grammatical or ungrammatical, or they didn't write any of the idea, and thus we can't give them, they didn't have any opportunity to use a form. So what this says is that you can't say produced, did not produce. This seems like too blunt of a way to assess students' productions. And if you're like me, I want to give my students as much credit as possible for what they produce, right? So now we're to the chart. And I want to kind of point out a couple things. You'll see the target grammar is at the top. And then we have two main categories, which is use and non-use. And what I'd like to do is to walk you through this. And I'm going to show you some student examples, and basically I'm going to go left to right, and I'm going to start with A and describe each of these categories. So I'm actually going to go to the document camera now, so we can all look at the same thing together. Okay, so just a brief overview of what you're looking at here. This is the same text as the worksheet that I've given you, and this is one of the two that we used in our research project. And then we broke, so the grammar points are both underlined in the text, and then they're also broken out into categories like this so that you can see what we were looking for. So then, you will see on page 2, you will see our first, so these are sample productions by category. And this is where the side-by-side comes in handy. Okay, so the first category that we're looking at is A. And we basically break it down like this, so that the form was used, and it was grammatical. And the first type of use is text-based argument structure. So you can see here, this is an exact reproduction of the original. So the original is expected to double, and the student has produced exactly that, is expected to double. So this is definitely category A of being both use, well, actually all three. Use, it's grammatical, and it's a text-based argument structure. Okay, so then we go to B, and the only difference is that this is what we decided to label as innovative argument structure. And so the original is thinking about giving, and I gave two examples for this one. So the first production was the government started to give extra money. Okay. So we still have an infinitive, which is one of the two forms that we were looking for as far as a target. And it is grammatical, and it is pretty close to the meaning. So let's give some proper credit to this student. And then the second one is Italy government plans to increase. And the reason I have this in bold is because then it leads to this give over here, which so we have plans to give, and that's still, within the realm of what we're talking about. Again, we have the infinitive, so we want to give credit for that, and it is grammatical, so we want to give credit for that as well. Then we come to the malformed. And there's two ways that we can go with this. This is shorthand to say that there is an error in the phrase, but not in the target grammar. And let's just talk about that one right now. So this is C and D. And so in C, this is based on the text. This is text-based argument structure. So again, this phrase is thinking about giving, and the student, the government, is thinking giving. Oh, so close, right? But there is something wrong with the form from a grammatical standpoint, right? And then we also have the innovative argument structure. So again, there's an error in the phrase, but not in the target grammar. And in this case, we were looking for started falling, and the student wrote became falling. Okay, so the innovation here is using a different word, but then, of course, this is not grammatically correct, and that's why it's malformed. With me so far? So now let's go to the other side of malformed, which is where there's an error in the target structure itself. And so again, we have these two categories, one that's text-based, and in this case, the example is that we're looking for plans to increase, and the student has written try to increase. Oh, darn it. So if this were tries, we could give them pretty full credit, but because it's the wrong verb form, then we have to put it into this category. And then for the innovative structure under this category, this target is thinking about giving, and in this case, the student said want to give. So, okay, there's this that we can give credit for, but the fact that this is incorrect, and that this really is not specifically the target, this is an innovation, that's why we've labeled this F. And I can see a couple faces like, this is not black and white. This is a ballpark, as close. We definitely, as coders, had some pretty heated arguments sometimes, but in general, this seemed to work pretty well, and if nothing else, it really gave us a good system to use to think about how much credit we should be giving our students. So then we go into the other part of this system, which is the non-use, which you would think would be nothing, but no. We actually have some rephrasals, and they can either be grammatical or malformed. So for category H, an example here is the target was expected to double, and the student has written doubled. Okay, so there's a rephrasal, and it's grammatical. It does not match the form that we're looking for, which is either a gerund or infinitive, but do you want to give this student a 0 for this? Right? And then, of course, the rephrasal that is malformed, the target here seemed to be increasing and just increase. Okay, so a little bit of credit, but not the right form, not grammatical, so this is a category J. And then finally category N, which means there was nothing there to see. Something I want to point out about this chart is that actually you will see that it's A, B, C, D, E, F, H, J. And that's because we actually used to have 2 categories under each of these, but we decided that that was just a little too fine-tuning, and we decided to collapse those categories, but H and J are better than G and I, how I can be ambiguous. So that was the thought process behind that. So let me see how our time is. Oh, good. So what I'd like to do now is to give you a chance to try to use this system. So on page 4, I have provided 2 solo productions and a pair. And what I would suggest is that I give you, 3 to 5 minutes to see how far you can get in these productions, and then we'll talk about them together. And if you want to work with a partner, you're certainly welcome to do so. I'm sorry, thank you. That is where to put your rating, if it's an A or B or J. Oh, it's okay.